Hollywood movies like 300 made you believe that Leonidas and his small band of Spartan warriors were the ultimate shield of Western civilization, slaughtering over 10,000 Persians in a display of godlike combat. It is a cinematic masterpiece, but as a historical record, it is a calculated deception. What if I told you that the heroic sacrifice at Thermopylae was actually a catastrophic strategic failure that almost handed Greece to the Persian Empire on a silver platter? The version in history you've been sold was designed to hide a much darker reality, a story of Spartan arrogance, military incompetence, and a geopolitical betrayal that nearly erased Athens from the map. While you were cheering for the capes and the shields, you missed the fact that the Spartans weren't saving Greece. They were hiding in a corner, terrified of their own slaves. If you think the Spartans were the greatest warriors in history, you are a victim of the oldest propaganda machine in the world. And today, we are going to dismantle the myth, piece by piece, starting with the map that proves Leonidas shouldn't have been there in the first place. To understand the scale of the Spartan lie, you have to look at the cold, hard numbers of ancient logistics. Xerxes did not lead a million-man army of mindless monsters. He led a sophisticated, multi-ethnic superpower. His goal wasn't to destroy Greece, but to absorb it. And while Hollywood focuses on the mountain pass, the real war was being fought on the waves. The defense of Greece relied entirely on the Athenian navy at Artemisium. Without the ships, the Spartans at Thermopylae would have been bypassed and ignored within hours. But the Spartans despised the Athenians. They were so obsessed with their own purity and military image that they refused to coordinate a real defense. Leonidas took 300 men to a bottleneck not to win a war, but because the Spartan elite was too paranoid to send a real army. Why would the greatest warriors on Earth send a suicide squad instead of an army? The answer is a secret Hollywood refused to show: the Helots. Sparta was a slave state. For every one Spartan warrior, there were 10 enslaved people waiting for the moment to revolt and slit their masters' throats. Sparta didn't stay home because of a religious festival. They stayed home because they were a prison state terrified of their own inmates. Leonidas went to Thermopylae with a skeleton crew because the Spartan government was paralyzed by fear. This wasn't a tactical choice, it was a desperate PR move to make it look like they were helping while they actually prepared to abandon the rest of Greece. They were building a wall at the Isthmus of Corinth, essentially saying to the rest of the Greeks, "You are on your own, we are saving ourselves." The result of the heroic stand was a total military disaster. The Persians didn't just win, they annihilated the Spartan force and marched straight into the heart of Greece. Because of the delay at the pass, a delay that lasted only 3 days, Athens was left completely exposed. The Persians didn't stop. They burned the Acropolis to the ground. They turned the cradle of democracy into a graveyard. While the movies celebrate the death of Leonidas, the contemporary Greeks were screaming in betrayal. The Spartan sacrifice achieved nothing of strategic value. It didn't stop the invasion, it accelerated the destruction of Sparta's rivals. And this is where the mystery deepens. Was the failure at Thermopylae an accident, or was it a calculated move by the Spartan elders to let the Persians destroy Athens so Sparta could remain the only power left in the region? The story of the 300 is the ultimate history is written by the victors scenario. After the war ended, thanks to Athenian brains and a lucky storm at sea, Sparta needed to justify why they were still in charge. They couldn't admit they were incompetent cowards who stayed behind a wall while Athens burned. So they invented the cult of the glorious death. They turned a massacre into a myth. They made sure that for the next 2,000 years, you would remember the bronze shields, but forget the burned cities and the betrayed allies. But as we dig into the declassified archaeological records and the writings of those who survived the Spartan protection, a much sinister pattern emerges. Sparta wasn't a land of heroes. It was a failing society with a shrinking population and a broken economy that used propaganda to survive. In the next part, we will expose how the legendary Spartan training was actually a blueprint for psychological trauma and how their invincible army lost more battles than they ever won.
If the myth of Thermopylae was the shield of Spartan propaganda, their training system, the agoge, was the spear. Hollywood portrays the Spartan upbringing as a brutal but perfect forge, turning boys into invincible killing machines. You've seen the images, young men fighting wolves in the snow, standing shirtless against the elements, emerging as elite super soldiers. But the reality was far more pathetic. The Agoge was not a military training program. It was a state-sponsored system of psychological trauma that produced soldiers who were excellent at standing in a line, but utterly incapable of adapting to a changing world. While the rest of Greece was inventing philosophy, theater, and advanced naval tactics, Sparta was busy perfecting the art of professional bullying. The greatest secret of the Spartan military is that they weren't actually better fighters than their neighbors. In one-on-one combat, a Spartan was no more skilled than a dedicated hoplite from Thebes or Argos. Their only advantage was that they were the only full-time professional army in a world of part-time citizen soldiers. But this professionalism came at a price that eventually destroyed them. The Spartan population was in a state of permanent collapse because their standards for perfection were so insanely rigid, they were constantly disqualifying their own citizens. If you couldn't pay for your place in the military mess hall, you were stripped of your rights. If you weren't perfect enough, you were cast out. By the time of the Persian Wars, the number of true Spartans, the elite Spartiates, had dwindled from thousands to a few hundred. They were an endangered species. This is why they were so terrified of battle. Every Spartan lost was a hole in their national defense that couldn't be filled. While empires like Persia could lose 10,000 men and replace them by lunch, the loss of 50 Spartans was a national catastrophe. This created a military paradox. The greatest warriors in the world were the most afraid to actually go to war. They spent more time practicing parades and terrorizing their own slaves than they did winning significant strategic victories. The world's perception of Spartan invincibility was finally shattered not by a Persian king, but by a group of Athenian light infantry at the Battle of Sphacteria. In this forgotten chapter of history, the invincible Spartans did the unthinkable. They surrendered. They didn't die to the last man. They didn't fight with their teeth and nails. They laid down their shields and begged for mercy. The shockwave felt across Greece was equivalent to a modern nuclear blast. The myth was broken. The elite warriors were just men, and men who were remarkably bad at fighting anyone who didn't play by their rigid, outdated rules. The Spartans were specialized in a form of warfare that was already becoming obsolete, the heavy phalanx. They were like a heavyweight boxer who only knows how to throw a left hook. The moment an opponent used scouts, archers, or unconventional maneuvers, the Spartans panicked. Their rigid society produced rigid minds. They couldn't innovate, they couldn't build ships, they couldn't manage a complex economy. They were a one-trick pony in a world that was moving toward total, multi-domain warfare. But the most damning evidence against the Spartan myth is the Battle of Leuctra. Here, a smaller force from the city of Thebes used a simple tactical innovation, a deeper wing of infantry, and absolutely crushed the Spartan army. In a single afternoon, the Spartan super soldiers were wiped out. The invincibility was proven to be a centuries-long bluff. Thebes didn't just beat Sparta, they liberated the Helots, the slaves that Sparta had spent centuries torturing. Without their slaves to grow their food, the Spartan warrior elite fell apart almost overnight. They didn't know how to farm, they didn't know how to trade, they only knew how to be soldiers, and they weren't even the best at that anymore. So why do we still worship them? Because the Spartan image is a powerful drug. It appeals to our desire for simplicity, strength, and discipline. But as a geopolitical strategy, the Spartan way was a suicide pact. They sacrificed their children, their culture, and their future to maintain a lie of superiority. The ultimate tragedy of the Spartan myth is not that it's a lie, but that the Spartans themselves were the ones who finally destroyed the very Western freedom they supposedly died to protect. If you still believe that Leonidas and his men were the martyrs of liberty, the final chapter of their history will be a bitter pill to swallow. After decades of posing as the invincible defenders of Greece, the Spartans committed the ultimate geopolitical sin. In their desperate, petty jealousy of Athens, the Spartans did the unthinkable. They went back to the Persians. They didn't go back to fight them, they went back to beg for gold. The Peloponnesian War was a brutal, multi-decade civil war that tore Greece apart, and for most of it, Sparta was losing. They couldn't match the Athenian navy, and they couldn't fund a long-term conflict.
So the brave warriors of Sparta made a secret deal with the great king of Persia, the successor of the very Xerxes they had fought at Thermopylae. The deal was simple: Persian gold in exchange for Greek freedom. The Spartans sold the Greek cities of Asia Minor back into Persian slavery just so they could afford to build enough ships to burn Athens. The shield of Greece had become the mercenary of the East. This is the part of the story Hollywood will never film. There is no glory in a Spartan general sitting in a Persian palace taking bribes to betray his own culture. But this was the reality of Spartan diplomacy. They were a one-dimensional society that only understood power through force. When force failed, they turned to corruption. By the time they finally won the war against Athens, Greece was a hollow shell of its former self. The great philosophers, the architects, and the democratic dreamers were silenced by Spartan occupation. But the Spartan victory was short-lived. A society built on the backs of slaves and fueled by military propaganda cannot survive the cold reality of peace. As the Spartans tried to rule over all of Greece, their own internal rot accelerated. Their population was so small that they couldn't even garrison the cities they had conquered. The invincible army was spread too thin, led by generals who were easily corrupted by the very wealth they had been trained to despise. By the time they finally won the war against Athens, Greece was a hollow shell of its former self. The great philosophers, the architects, and the democratic dreamers were silenced by Spartan occupation. So why does the legend of the 300 still echo today? Because it is a convenient tool for anyone who wants to sell the idea of might makes right. The Spartan myth is used by modern regimes and extremist groups to justify brutality and reject intellectualism. They want you to believe that 300 pure warriors are better than 1,000,000 others. But history shows us the opposite. The Spartans were a strategic failure. They were a demographic disaster, and in the end, they were the biggest traitors in the history of the Mediterranean. The real heroes of the Persian Wars weren't the men who died in a pass because they were too stubborn to retreat. The real heroes were the thousands of anonymous Greeks, the sailors, the farmers, and the thinkers who actually built a world worth defending. While Sparta was busy dying, Athens was busy living. And while Sparta is now nothing more than a collection of dusty rocks and a failed ideology, the ideas of their rivals, democracy, science, and art, are what actually built the modern world. The next time you see a bronze shield or a red cape on a screen, remember the dark window of Spartan history. Remember the slaves they tortured, the allies they betrayed, and the Persian gold they took to stay in power. The Spartans didn't defeat the Persians, they joined them when it suited their greed. The history you weren't told is that the greatest warriors were actually the greatest frauds. And in the game of geopolitics, a lie can last for 2,000 years, but the truth always waits for the light.